Danger Along the Ohio, Chapter 9. Clara continued to complain about the Indian and his weapon, but Amos pretended not to hear. He and Jonathan cracked the remaining walnuts and picked out the kernels while the frog meat cooked. After accepting only a few nuts and a cup of water, the Indian sank into a deep sleep. While Clara went to the creek to bathe, Amos and Jonathan scoured the woods around the campsite for firewood. Twilight had come by the time they had gathered enough fuel to last the night. They cleared a place by the fire for a game of marbles and became so engrossed in their play that they didn't notice Clara had returned until she spoke. "Someone's mighty interested in your marbles," she said to them. When they looked up, she waved a thumb over her shoulder at the Indian. The boy had risen up on one elbow to watch them play, but as soon as they looked in his direction, he turned away. "He's probably never seen any marbles before," Amos said. "He has a blue stone in that pouch he wears around his neck," Clara said. "It's as smooth as a marble, but it's flat." "It must be really important to him," Amos said, "especially since he pulled a knife on you for looking at it." He grinned at her, then went on, "I wonder what tribe he belongs to." "What difference does it make?" Clara said. "The important thing to know is that he's a savage." Amos didn't contradict Clara, even though he disagreed with her. The Indian was just a boy like him, but injured and alone, and he thought a little afraid. He gathered up his marbles and dropped them into a pouch. "Did you notice his moccasins?" Jonathan remarked. "How do you reckon he colored the deerskin red?" "Blackberries will dye almost anything red," Clara told him, "even wood." "You'd make a real good Indian," Amos said with a solemn face. "I have no aspirations to be a savage," Clara said, and turned her attention to her knapsack. Piece by piece, she emptied the contents out onto the ground. When she pulled out the pistol, she cast a sideways glance at Amos. "I wonder if this would... Surely the powder's dry by this time." She tilted the barrel downward over the corner of her shawl, tapping it gently until the lead ball and the cloth patch fell out. When the lump of powder followed, she picked it up and crumbled it between her fingers. "It's ruined," she said. Amos's stomach tightened, and he jammed his hands into his pockets. He hated the sight of the pistol, and without powder it was useless anyway. Maybe she would leave it there in the woods when they continued their journey. Clara blew into the priming hole, then released a loud breath. "Amos, I'm as dense as a lop-eared mule." "What are you talking about?" "I forgot about. Right here on the gun. There's on the gun hammer, there's flint. We could have made a fire any time with it." As if to prove her words, she squeezed the trigger, and the flint struck steel, throwing off a bright spark. Amos flinched, and his heart started thumping in his chest. He should have taken that thing away from her on the boat and thrown it overboard. She'd keep it for sure now. He rose to his feet and stalked off into the deepening darkness. Not thinking of where he was headed, Amos soon found himself on the bank of the Ohio. Moonlight through the trees cast a dense, black shadow over the river. Back in Pennsylvania, it would have been a perfect night to play hide-and-seek in the hay-mow, or to sit in a tree and listen to the whippoorwills talk. He sagged down on the riverbank, remembering Simon. If only he could live last year over again. There would be no haunting memories, no awful guilt. He sat there a long time thinking how Simon would have loved the moonlight and the rippling river. After a while, he got up and tramped along the riverbank, his thoughts wandering like the night wind through the trees. A noise overhead made him freeze in his tracks. Looking up, he saw dark shapes silhouetted against the glowing sky. It was a massive flock of Carolina parakeets roosting in a massive sycamore tree. Maybe they were like chickens, Amos thought, listless and half-blind in the dark. If he was stealthy and patient, he might be able to catch one. He crept over to the sycamore tree, then pulled himself up onto a low limb. Two birds squatted on a bough just a couple of feet above him, their heads tucked into their wing feathers. Moving as slowly and quietly as a snail, Amos inched back along the rough tree trunk until he stood upright. Then, grasping a branch with one hand, he reached out and snatched the nearest parakeet by the neck. The bird began to flap its powerful wings, pulling Amos off balance, and he lost his grip on the branch. His feet slipped out from under him and he fell, crashing through the leafy branches on his way to the ground. Though the thick layer of dead leaves cushioned his landing, for a moment he was too dazed to know what had happened. Then he grinned. He was still clutching the parakeet. Overhead, the frightened birds floundered through the foliage, breaking off leaves and small limbs, squawking their alarm. He hoped there were no Indians near enough to hear all that commotion. The bird in his hand made no sound at all. Eager to show everyone his catch, he sprang to his feet and cut back toward the camp. The fire had died down to a few smoldering logs, and Clara sat before it, staring into the embers. Jonathan and the Indian were sleeping. At the sound of Amos's bare feet rustling through the dry leaves, Clara jerked upright. "What is that in your hand?" she asked. "It's a Carolina parakeet. It must weigh 5 or 6 pounds. "How in the world?" Clara exclaimed. Amos grinned at her. "They had already gone to roost. I just grabbed one and held on. It managed to knock me out of the tree, but it didn't get away." He took the dead bird and lodged it in the crotch of a nearby tree, then came back to the fire. As he sat down, Clara spoke again. "Don't you think we should be getting on to Marietta, Amos? We've been here 2 days, and there's no telling how much ground we have to cover yet." "How's the Indian?" Amos asked, rather than try to answer her question. "I gave him some willow bark tea. He just sits there and stares at me. It's scary. There's no way of knowing what he's thinking behind those wild eyes." "He's probably wondering what we're doing here in the woods, the same as we're wondering about him." "Amos, you don't mean for us to take him along with us, do you?" "Go for Mr. Mummy." "Yes." Sorry, guys. Amos wasn't used to making decisions, but if he left it up to Clara, she would want to leave the Indian. In Amos's mind, abandoning the boy would be almost as bad as leaving Jonathan behind. "We can take him with us until he can get along on his own. I expect he'll be able to walk with some help." "The more he heals, the more dangerous he'll be," Clara warned. "He's still got that knife, and he hates us for sure. It wouldn't..." "Don't you ever think maybe he's afraid of us?" "Afraid? Why, he wouldn't have the sense to be afraid of a she-bear with 3 cubs." "He probably doesn't trust us either," Amos went on, ignoring her remark. "If only we could talk to him and make him understand what we intend to do." "Sassafras, Amos, you can't reason with a savage." Amos slapped at a mosquito. He just couldn't think of the Indian as Clara did. Even though the boy was different from them, somehow it didn't seem very important here in the woods. The only thing that mattered was surviving. Amos recalled their meager supper, wondering how long the Indian had gone without food. At first light, he'd clean the bird and get it roasting. The plump fowl would go a long way toward easing everyone's hunger. "Well, if we're not going to decide anything, you might as well go to sleep," Clara said, turning her back on him. It was still pitch dark when Clara shook him awake. "Everything's quiet," she said, then curled up in the leaves. Amos rose and walked around the fire, pausing to look at the Indian, then Jonathan and Queen Anne. The Jersey cow gazed up at him, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. How lucky they were, he thought, that they had the cow. She not only gave them milk, but she was a constant reminder of the family life they used to have. Amos added a log to the fire, then sat down to wait for daybreak. As soon as the woods began to brighten, Amos took the bird to a nearby stream and set to work. He laid aside some orange and yellow head feathers and several long green tail feathers for Clara. She didn't have any use for them here in the woods, but she could carry them on to Marietta. They were pretty enough to use for decorations, or they could be fashioned into quill pens. Juices from the roasting fowl were dripping into the fire by the time the others began to stir. When Clara was wide awake, Amos handed her the feathers. "Aren't they nice?" she said, and took a yellow one and stuck it in her hair. Then she noticed the Indian staring at her. "What's he looking at?" she said, her hands settling on her hips. Amos couldn't pass up the chance to tease her. "I'll bet he's thinking you're as pretty as an Indian girl with that feather in your hair." Clara dismissed his words with a wave of her hand and walked away toward the stream. While Amos was turning the bird on a spit, he heard a noise and looked around. The Indian had managed to sit up. Then he turned over on his hands and knees and pushed himself to his feet. Swaying from side to side, he remained on his feet. Amos was sure through sheer willpower alone. Amos stepped toward him and held out his hand, offering to help. Reading a warning in the boy's eyes, he dropped his hand away. In spite of the silent rebuke, he felt a tingle of satisfaction. He and the Indian might not be able to talk back and forth, but they certainly understood each other just now. From the corner of his eye, Amos watched the boy take a few faltering steps, then turn his back on the campsite and massage his injured leg. The brief exchange set Amos to wondering as he returned to the fire. Maybe if they kept talking, they'd eventually understand each other. There had to be a way for them to communicate. Jonathan sat up and plopped the beaver hat on his head. "I see Red Moccasin is up and walking." "What did you call him?" "Red Moccasin, on account of his shoes. Even an Indian has to have a name." He's right, Amos thought. They ought to call him something besides just the Indian. The name Red Moccasin would do until they learned his real Indian name. Later, when Amos pronounced the roasted bird ready to eat, they gathered around the fire for the best meal they had had since they had left Wheeling Town. Amos broke off a brown chunk of the bird and went toward the Indian. The injured boy had returned to his bed of leaves and lay with his eyes closed, but they came open at Amos's approach. His gaze never left Amos's face, even as he accepted the cooked meat. "This ought to make you feel better," Amos said. The boy uttered a harsh grunt that might have been a word, then bit into the meat. After the bird's skeleton had been picked clean and the bones chewed to splinters, Clara spoke again about them continuing downriver. "I think we should stay here one more day," Amos said. "We need to get to Marietta," Clara said, "and find out about—" "No need to be in a hurry," Amos broke in, then stopped. He started to say there was no need to be in a hurry to Marietta just to get bad news. Until they got there, they could still believe their father was alive. "Right now we need food worse than we need to get to Marietta," he finished. "I could catch some more frogs," Jonathan said. "And I might be able to catch another parakeet," Amos added. He had already made up his mind to go out at sundown and locate their roosting place. Looking from one to the other, Clara grumbled under her breath, reluctantly giving in. "All right, one more day, but then I'm going to Marietta with or without you." The Indian must have used up all his strength because he lay on his bed hardly moving. He appeared to be sleeping when Clara and Jonathan went off to collect wood. Amos walked down to the bank of the Ohio in hopes of seeing or hearing the parakeets. From the edge of the forest shade, he squinted at the noonday sun sparkling on the water. The Ohio was wide here and steep. Wooded banks lined the far shore. It was as peaceful as a pasture field at dusk. He proceeded upstream, watching and listening for the parakeets. Not finding any, he climbed onto a limb of a willow tree leaning out over the water, where he could view the whole river without exposing himself. What he saw almost made him fall into the water. A flatboat was skimming downstream at a good speed, hugging the south shore. As it came close, Amos could make out figures on the deck. There were no women or children in sight, only men staring and pointing across the river at the north bank. Some knelt at the railing, aiming their long-barreled rifles in that direction. Leaning out as far as he dared, Amos gazed along the bank on his side of the river. A movement caught his eye, and he sucked in a noisy breath. A mile or so away on a flat, treeless bluff, 3 Indians were standing in the bright sun, watching the flatboat. Amos's gaze swung back to the boat. It was opposite him now, and he looked with longing at the men who could save him. But he knew they would never stop. The Indians were too close. Besides, he couldn't leave without Clara and Jonathan. He watched the boat pass, then focused one more time on the Indians. A moment longer they stared at the river, then abruptly turned their backs on it. Amos strained to see if they were coming downstream, but they had disappeared into the trees. His throat felt as dry as scorched leather. Even if he hid from them, they were bound to smell the smoke from the campfire. He had to get back and warn the others. Jumping from the tree to the shore, he scrambled into the woods and sped toward camp. Ooh,